What does a house remember when the people inside can no longer agree on what happened there? Most homes are built to hold ordinary life. They gather the smell of dinner, the rhythm of footsteps, the soft static of television in another room. Over time, walls become witnesses. They absorb arguments, laughter, grief, silence. We call these places shelter, but perhaps that word is too simple. A shelter protects the body. A home also keeps the echo of a life. Across the last century, a small number of houses have slipped into public memory for a different reason. Not because they were beautiful, not because they were historic, but because something inside them seemed to resist explanation. In these places, families said they heard movements that had no visible source. Officers arrived expecting domestic confusion and left with reports they could not neatly file away. Clergy entered with prayers, doctors entered with questions. Social workers, journalists, neighbors, skeptics all stepped across thresholds believing that every event has a cause. Many of them walk back out less certain than before. This is not a journey to prove the supernatural. It is something quieter and perhaps more unsettling. It is a journey through the moments when ordinary systems of authority met experiences they could not comfortably translate into language. A police report can describe a chair moving. A medical chart can record distress. A photograph can preserve a room after midnight. But none of these tools, for all their precision, fully explain what fear becomes when it settles into a place and refuses to leave. In the chapters ahead, we will visit 10 homes marked by witnesses, paperwork, and long argument. Some stories may reveal the elasticity of memory. Others may suggest how grief, belief, and environment can shape what people perceive. And some will remain suspended in that difficult space between fact and meaning. Because perhaps the deepest mystery is not whether a house can be haunted, but why human beings keep returning to the threshold, hoping the unknown will finally speak in a language we can bear to hear. What happens when a routine call leads trained professionals to the edge of language? In Gary, Indiana, on a quiet street lined with modest homes, there stood a small rental house that looked like thousands of others. Beige siding, narrow yard. Nothing in its appearance suggested that it would become one of the most disputed addresses in recent American memory. Yet by the winter of 2011, that house had begun to gather attention not because of what it showed the world, but because of what it seemed to show the people inside. LaToya Ammons had moved there with her children, hoping for something simple: stability, a place to begin again. Instead, the family described a slow invasion of the unexplainable. Black flies appeared in cold weather when they should not have been there at all. Heavy steps crossed rooms in the middle of the night. Wet footprints surfaced on the floor and then ended abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished mid-stride. At first, these details sounded like the ordinary confusion of stress and adjustment. But then the children changed. Their behavior grew erratic, frightening, difficult to place inside any familiar diagnosis. Voices seemed to emerge from them that did not belong to childhood. Outbursts came and went like storms, followed by blank stretches of memory. When police, medical staff, and child protection workers entered the story, they expected crisis. What they did not expect was to leave written statements describing events they could not reconcile with reason. That is what makes this house linger in the American imagination. Not simply the claim that something unnatural occurred, but the fact that institutions built on procedure found themselves speaking in uncertain tones. In that home, authority did not disappear, it hesitated. And sometimes hesitation tells us more than certainty ever could. When a case cannot be neatly explained away, the mystery is no longer only in the house. It begins to settle inside the people who witnessed it. Can a single moving chair alter the way an entire country thinks about evidence? In the late summer of 1901, on an otherwise ordinary street in Enfield, North London, a modest brick house became the setting for one of the most argued over cases in modern Britain. Nothing about 284 Green Street suggested history. It was a working family's home, crowded with daily routines, small worries, school nights, dishes in the sink. Then, almost without warning, the atmosphere changed. The children said their beds shook. Their mother heard knocks from inside the walls. Furniture shifted with a force that seemed both deliberate and unseen. At first, it sounded like the kind of story neighbors tell in lowered voices and laugh off by morning. But then the police were called. One officer later described seeing a chair move across the floor without anyone touching it. That detail mattered. Not because it proved anything conclusively, but because it placed the story inside official language. A private fear had crossed into the public record. Soon the house filled with more than anxiety. Reporters arrived. Investigators came carrying notebooks, tape recorders, cameras, and skepticism. At the center of it all was young Janet Hodgson, whose strange trances and harsh, unfamiliar voice turned the case from unsettling to deeply divisive. Some believed she was performing under pressure, improvising within a storm of adult attention. Others insisted there were too many witnesses, too many incidents, too many moments that seemed to resist easy dismissal. That is what has kept Enfield alive in cultural memory. Not certainty, but conflict. The photographs, the recordings, the testimony, the doubt, all of it remains suspended between explanation and enigma. And perhaps that is why the story still unsettles us. It asks whether truth must always arrive in clean, stable form, or whether sometimes reality appears fragmented, carried in frightened voices, flawed witnesses, and the uneasy silence that follows when no explanation feels complete. What if these most enduring mysteries are not hidden in castles or ruins, but inside the plain geometry of an American farmhouse? Long before it became a destination for filmmakers, tourists, and late-night debate, the house in Harrisville, Rhode Island, was simply a place where a family tried to live. Weathered wood, open land, winter wind moving across the fields. In 1971, when Roger and Carolyn Perron moved there with their 5 daughters, they were not stepping into legend. They were stepping into the familiar challenge of making an old house feel like home. For a time, that was all it seemed to be. Then the atmosphere shifted in ways that were difficult to describe without sounding unreasonable. Small objects vanished and reappeared. Doors opened on their own. There were sudden smells of decay in empty rooms, cold pockets of air in the middle of summer, and the persistent feeling that someone else was moving through the house after dark. The daughters would later speak of whispers, shadows, and presences that seemed less imagined than encountered. Carolyn, more than anyone, felt the weight of it. She described the home not as dramatic or theatrical, but as oppressive, as though the air itself had learned how to watch. Over time, local history folded into family experience. Stories surfaced about earlier residents, private sorrows, unexplained deaths, and a landscape layered with memory long before the Perrons arrived. Whether those fragments were evidence or narrative scaffolding remained an open question. Yet anyone who has lived in an old home knows how quickly history can begin to feel personal. A stain on the floor becomes a clue. A draft becomes a message. The past starts leaning against the present. That may be the real power of a place like this. It reveals how easily a house can become more than architecture. It becomes a vessel for fear, inheritance, folklore, and the human need to connect sensation with story. And once that process begins, the question is no longer just what happened there. It is why some places seem to awaken our oldest instinct, the feeling that time is not gone at all, only waiting in the next room. How does an ordinary neighborhood react when a single house begins to embarrass the laws of physics? In November 1974, on Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a small bungalow became the center of an American spectacle. It was not remote, it was not hidden in woods or set apart on some lonely road. It stood among other homes under the same streetlights, inside the same routines of school mornings and evening television. And that may be what made the events there feel so unsettling. Mystery had arrived in a place built for familiarity. The Gooden family first noticed sounds that did not belong to the house. Knocks came from inside the walls. Furniture shifted, a television tipped, appliances behaved as if they had moods of their own. Then the disturbances grew harder to dismiss. A chair moved without help. A crucifix tore loose from the wall. Neighbors gathered. Police officers came, then came back, and then returned again with the uneasy understanding that they were no longer responding to a normal call. Some later said objects moved in front of them. Firefighters and reporters added their own witness accounts. What began as domestic confusion became public theater. Soon the block itself changed character. Crowds formed outside. Curiosity fed fear, and fear fed rumor. The house was no longer just a structure. It became a stage on which belief and skepticism performed side by side. At the center of the case stood a young girl, Marcia, whose presence seemed tied to the activity. That detail gave doubters an anchor. Perhaps it was fraud. Perhaps stress had taken a strange form. Perhaps the adults, the officers, the journalists had all stepped into a story they were too overwhelmed to resist. And yet, the case never settled cleanly. Some witnesses stood by what they saw. Others accepted the official turn toward hoax and moved on. That unresolved tension may be the real legacy of Lindley Street, not proof of the paranormal, but proof that human beings often prefer a flawed explanation to an open wound in reality. Because once a chair moves in front of enough people, the deeper question is no longer what happened in the room. It is how quickly we rebuild certainty after watching it fail. What remains in a home after suffering has taken on a pattern of its own. In West Pittston, Pennsylvania, a duplex on Chase Street should have been the setting for recovery. Jack and Janet Smurl moved there in the mid-1970s after a flood had already taught them how quickly ordinary life can be undone. They wanted what most families want after disaster: clean walls, steady routines, a chance to begin again without looking back. But some houses do not feel empty when you enter them. They feel occupied by tension, as if the air has been waiting. At first, the disturbances sounded almost domestic in their ambiguity. Appliances failed without reason. Dark stains appeared, then vanished. Odors drifted through rooms with no visible source. The children heard whispers at night, and Jack woke to the strange sensation that someone, or something, had been pulling at the bedclothes. These details might have been dismissed one by one: stress, faulty wiring, poor sleep. The ordinary language of explanation held, but only briefly. As the years passed, the household described something more invasive. Knocks came from inside the walls. Scratches appeared on bodies. Apparitions were reported in daylight. Janet spoke of being physically attacked by an unseen force, while Jack described an experience so severe it seemed to erase the boundary between nightmare and waking life. Neighbors heard disturbances. Police responded more than once and found no clear cause. Clergy came, investigators came, exorcisms were attempted, yet the family said the activity only deepened, as if attention itself had become fuel. That is what gives the Smurl case its enduring force. It was not a single night, a single spectacle, or a single witness. It stretched across years, wearing down certainty the way water wears stone. Public opinion split, as it always does, between belief and suspicion. But beyond that argument was a quieter tragedy, a family trying to protect one another while living in a place that no longer felt governed by ordinary safety. And perhaps that is the deeper question here. When a home becomes a site of prolonged fear, does it matter whether the force is named correctly, if the suffering it leaves behind is unmistakably real? Can a house become so deeply woven into folklore that it begins to feel haunted before anyone even opens the door? In Amityville, on the south shore of Long Island, there is a Dutch colonial house whose image has become almost inseparable from American fear. Its windows, curved like watchful eyes, have appeared in books, films, arguments, jokes, and endless late-night conversations. But before the mythology hardened, there was first a real and terrible crime. In November 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family were murdered inside the home. Whatever came later, that fact remained the dark foundation beneath the story. A year after the killings, George and Kathy Lotz moved in with their children, hoping that the house's troubled history would remain history. They stayed only 28 days. In that short time, they claimed to experience a succession of disturbances that seemed almost designed to erode ordinary confidence. Cold rooms, swarms of flies in winter, strange odors, doors and windows behaving unpredictably, and the persistent feeling that the home was resisting them. George reportedly grew withdrawn and agitated, as though the house had begun shaping his moods. Kathy described sensations of presence, while the children spoke of unseen companions and nighttime fear that felt more intimate than imagination. The story spread quickly because it arrived already carrying 2 forms of gravity: documented violence and reported haunting. That combination made skepticism difficult to separate from fascination. Critics questioned timelines, motives, inconsistencies, and the role of commercial opportunity. Supporters pointed to the family's visible distress and the enduring sense that something in the house could not be reduced to mere invention. Over time, the debate became almost larger than the events themselves. And that may be why Amityville still matters. It reveals how tragedy changes a place long after the police leave and the headlines fade. A house touched by violence does not simply return to neutrality. People bring expectation into it, and expectation has weight. Sometimes that weight becomes rumor. Sometimes it becomes narrative. And sometimes, whether through memory, fear, or something we cannot name, it becomes a presence that follows the house for generations. What happens when grief enters a room and refuses to leave in silence? In a working-class district of Madrid, there was an apartment that did not look like the setting of national legend. It was small, practical, and close to the noise of ordinary life. Families passed in the hallway. Dishes were washed, windows open to the same city air as every other home on the block. And yet, after the death of a teenage girl named Estefania, the apartment seemed to change character. It no longer felt like a place where mourning could gradually soften. It felt like a place where mourning had become active. According to her family, the trouble began after a séance at school, an attempt to reach the dead through ritual and curiosity. Soon afterward, Estefania reportedly suffered seizures, disorientation, and episodes no doctor could clearly explain. In 1991, she died suddenly, leaving behind the kind of unanswered sorrow that can alter a household forever. Then the apartment began producing its own strange language. Doors slammed without warning. Voices seemed to pass through empty rooms. Religious objects were found displaced or damaged. Photographs warped in ways the family took personally, as though memory itself were being tampered with. The case grew larger when police entered the story. Officers responding to the home described sounds they could not locate, furniture moving unexpectedly, and a deep unease that did not behave like ordinary fear. Their presence changed everything. What had been a private family account became an official disturbance, written into reports, filed inside the machinery of the state. Spain, like every modern society, has institutions for crime, illness, and domestic crisis. It has fewer tools for events that seem to sit between categories. That is why the Vallecas case endures. It lives at the border between bereavement and belief, between trauma and phenomenon. Perhaps the apartment was a vessel for anguish, too intense to remain invisible. Perhaps something stranger took shape in the shadow of loss. Either way, the story asks a question that reaches beyond the supernatural. When a family says the dead have not entirely gone, are they describing a haunting of place or the unbearable persistence of love when explanation is no longer enough? What does isolation do to a story when there is no crowd to correct it and no neighbor close enough to hear? In the rolling countryside of Tennessee, the Bell Farm was once little more than a patch of earth shaped by labor, weather, and the fragile hope of family continuity. The year was 1817, and frontier life did not leave much room for fantasy. There were crops to tend, animals to feed, children to raise, debts to worry over, and long nights filled with the practical exhaustion of survival. It was in that hard-edged world, where every sound usually had a source, that the Bell family began reporting disturbances that would become one of the oldest and most enduring haunting legends in American history. At first, the signs were easy to mistake for natural strangeness. Odd animals appeared at the edge of the property. Scratching sounds moved along the walls. There were knocks at doors with no visitor standing outside, whispers in rooms that should have been empty, and the unsettling sense that attention was gathering around the family after dark. Then the events sharpened. Bed covers were pulled away. Children were pinched and slapped by unseen hands. A voice emerged, not merely as a sound, but as a personality, one that seemed to know private details and favored particular targets. Over time, that voice became central to the legend. It was said to speak, argue, mock, predict, even converse with guests who came from miles away to witness the strange happenings for themselves. Among them, later stories claimed it was Andrew Jackson, whose name helped cement the tale in the wider American imagination. Whether every detail was remembered accurately is impossible to know now. The Bell Witch story survived through retelling, and retelling has its own kind of weather. It preserves, distorts, enlarges, and sometimes turns pain into folklore. That may be why this case matters less as proof than as mirror. On the frontier, a house was never just a building. It was safety, inheritance, identity, and belief bound together in wood and land. When fear entered such a place, it threatened more than sleep. It threatened the very structure by which a family understood the world. And perhaps that is why the Bell story still lingers. Not because we can verify every detail, but because it captures an old human truth. When something unknown enters the home, it also enters the imagination, and there it can live for centuries. What if the most troubling houses are the ones that seem to call people back, even after fear should have driven everyone away? In the old mining town of Villisca, Iowa, there stands a white frame house that has become inseparable from one of the most brutal unsolved crimes in American history. In 1912, 8 people, including 6 children, were murdered there while they slept. The violence was intimate, deliberate, and never fully explained. No final answer arrived to settle the matter. No single name closed the file in the mind of the public. And when history leaves a wound open that long, imagination often begins to gather around it like fog. For decades, the house carried its silence. Then came the stories. Visitors reported footsteps where no one stood. Doors opened after being shut. Shadows moved across rooms that had already absorbed more darkness than most places should ever know. Some claimed to hear children's voices in the stillness. Others described pressure in the air, sudden dread, the strange emotional vertigo that can come when a place seems aware of your presence. Paranormal investigators, skeptics, historians, and curiosity seekers all cross the same threshold, each bringing a different theory and leaving with the same basic admission. Whatever one believes, the atmosphere inside is difficult to ignore. Of course, a house like Villisca does not need spirits to feel haunted. Human knowledge alone is enough. To stand where violence once unfolded without explanation is to encounter the unfinished. The mind resists blank spaces, especially when innocence was lost inside them. We search the walls for pattern, the floorboards for memory, the air itself for some residue of meaning. Perhaps that search is what people call haunting. Not always the return of the dead, but the refusal of the living to let a place remain mute. That may be why Villisca continues to draw us. It is not simply a site of fear. It is a house where history and imagination meet in the same dim room. And in that meeting lies a deeply human impulse, the belief that if we listen hard enough to silence, it might finally surrender what suffering was never able to explain. Can a family inherit not just a house, but a pattern of fear that seems older than any one generation? In Bothell, Washington, a quiet suburban home once became the center of one of the most intensely documented haunting claims in the United States. By appearance alone, it offered little hint of disturbance. It was the kind of house built for routine life: meals at the table, children in bed by nightfall, television lights spilling softly into the hallway. Yet in the late 1970s, the Diede family began describing events that gradually transformed that ordinary setting into a place of dread. It began with sounds and small disruptions. Footsteps where no one stood, knocks in empty rooms, household objects shifting just enough to unsettle, not enough to convince. Then the activity reportedly grew more aggressive. Family members described being touched or struck by unseen forces. Scratches appeared. One child seemed especially vulnerable, as though the disturbances had found a focal point. The father, Keith Linder, became increasingly determined to record what was happening. Photographs were taken, notes were kept. Investigators arrived, among them researchers who hoped documentation might succeed where belief alone could not. That effort gave the case unusual weight. This was not merely a story passed through rumor or folklore. It became a project of observation. Psychics, demonologists, skeptics, and paranormal investigators all entered the house, each carrying a different framework, and each, in some way, contributing to the growing mythology around it. Some believed the home contained evidence of a violent, intelligent force. Others argued the phenomena reflected misinterpretation, emotional strain, or a pattern of suggestion reinforced by attention itself. The more the family tried to prove what was happening, the more elusive certainty became. And perhaps that is the lesson lingering inside the Bothell case. Documentation can preserve a moment, but it cannot always stabilize meaning. A photograph may show a mark. A witness may describe a blow. A recorder may capture a sound in the dark. Yet none of these entirely resolves the deeper human question: What happens when lived experience outruns the language available to explain it? In that gap between record and understanding, mystery survives. Not as proof, but as a reminder that evidence and certainty are not always the same thing. What does a house become when every attempt to explain it only deepens the unease? In Hull, England, a narrow council house on council estate streets became the setting for a case that investigators would later describe with unusual seriousness. It belonged to the Pritchard family, and like many homes of its kind, it was built for practical life rather than mystery. Rooms were close together, sounds carried easily, neighbors knew one another's habits. It was the sort of place where any disturbance should have been easy to trace. Instead, in the mid-1960s, the house seemed to develop a life that no one inside could comfortably account for. At first, the activity sounded like the language of classic hauntings: knocks, moving objects, strange sensations in the dark. But then it shifted into something more visual, more public, harder to confine to the imagination. Family members and visitors reported seeing household items thrown across rooms. They described beds shaking, covers pulled away, and an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to concentrate around certain spaces. Most disturbing of all were sightings of a figure said to resemble an old woman, silent and watching, as if the house had chosen an image for its unrest. As word spread, the home drew investigators from the Society for Psychical Research and other observers who hoped patient attention might separate folklore from fact. Their notes did not erase doubt, but they did something more interesting. They preserved uncertainty with discipline. Rather than dismiss the family outright or surrender completely to belief, they recorded testimony, patterns, contradictions, and the emotional toll the events seemed to take. The house became less a spectacle than a study in how difficult it is to hold mystery in rational hands. That may be why this case still matters. It reminds us that the unknown does not always appear in grand gestures. Sometimes it settles into small rooms, among worn furniture and everyday routines, until the familiar itself begins to feel altered. And when that happens, the deepest fear may not be that a spirit has entered the house. It may be that the boundaries we rely on between matter and memory, perception and reality, are far less solid than we would like to believe. What if the last mystery is not in any one house, but in the pattern they create when placed side by side? By the time we arrive at the final home in this journey, something has changed. We are no longer listening only for footsteps in hallways or watching for objects that move when no hand is near. We are listening for repetition. A family enters a house with ordinary hopes. Strange events begin at the edge of explanation. Witnesses gather, institutions respond, belief divides from doubt. And somewhere in the middle of that cycle, a deeper question emerges. Why do these stories keep returning? In different countries, different centuries, different forms, yet with such familiar emotional weather. The final house, like the others, was made of timber, plaster, glass, wiring, rooms arranged for meals and sleep, and the small theater of everyday life. Nothing in its design demanded legend. And yet people inside it described the same slow unraveling we have heard before. The feeling of being watched, the sudden rearrangement of the ordinary, the sense that memory itself had become unstable. Whether one calls that haunting, trauma, suggestion, or something still unnamed, the effect was unmistakable. The home no longer behaved as a refuge. It became a question. That pattern may be more revealing than any single case file. These houses are not important because they prove another world. They matter because they illuminate this one. They show how fragile certainty can be when fear enters private space. They reveal how grief can cling to architecture, how rumor can grow around silence, how history can turn a staircase or bedroom into a vessel for meanings no blueprint ever intended. Above all, they remind us that human beings do not merely live in places. We interpret them. We fill them with memory, longing, superstition, and love. So perhaps the last house is every house that has ever held something its occupants could not fully name. A place where the known world thinned for a moment and people stood listening, not only for what might be out there, but for what such experiences awakened within themselves. And that leaves us at the threshold of the final question. When mystery enters the home, does it reveal the unseen, or does it simply reveal us more clearly? What, in the end, are we really searching for when we return to these houses again and again? Perhaps not proof. Proof is a clean instrument, and these stories are anything but clean. They are layered with grief, exaggeration, witness error, folklore, longing, and the very human habit of reaching for meaning when events refuse to settle into order. And yet to dismiss them entirely would be to ignore something important. Not necessarily the supernatural, but the deeper truth these houses seem to expose, that human beings are never fully at home in a universe they cannot completely explain. Across these stories, one pattern has remained constant. A house begins as shelter, then becomes a stage for uncertainty. Strange sounds, inexplicable movement, fragments of testimony, official reports, family distress, public fascination. Over time, the argument grows larger than the event. Was it haunting, misperception, trauma, performance, environmental influence, cultural contagion? The answers shift depending on who is asked. But beneath every explanation lies the same vulnerable fact. Someone, somewhere felt the ordinary world give way beneath their feet. That may be why these accounts continue to endure in an age of science, data, and surveillance. Modern life gives us extraordinary tools to measure the visible world, yet it has not erased our encounter with ambiguity. We still live among memories we cannot verify, intuitions we cannot defend, and losses we cannot neatly translate into language. A house, more than almost any other place, gathers those tensions. It holds our routines, our sleep, our private fears, our inheritance of stories. When something feels wrong there, even briefly, the disturbance reaches deeper than reason. So the final lesson may not be about ghosts at all. It may be about humility, about recognizing that truth is sometimes larger than the categories we build to contain it. Some mysteries will eventually yield to psychology, history, architecture, or science. Others may remain unresolved, not because they belong to another realm, but because human experience itself is often unresolved. And perhaps that is enough. Not certainty, but attention. Not fear, but wonder. In the quiet after every story, we are left with the same enduring image. A doorway, half lit, opening into a room we thought we understood. The question is not only what waits inside, the question is why we are still listening.